Book 7, The Soldier in the Middle of the World, Chapter 28. I have a plan, and it's not a selfish one. Planting season was coming. The last of that horrible year would be over in 4 days, and the new year was approaching. There was to be a celebration at the arena to welcome the year 365. The year had to be significant. It was the same number of years as it was the number of days in the year. The guide had declared that each village should be given extra rations on the first day to commemorate the new season when planting and everything else in their lives would begin again. The problem, the lieutenant realized, was that no one had told planting season it was expected. The snow on the ground was still a foot deep, when normally the last dusting of snow would have happened 4 weeks ago. None of the trees that survived showed any signs of budding, nor had any of the early flowers pushed up through the snows that still covered them. Everything still acted as if it was in the middle of raining, snowing season. The lieutenant was nervous, but no one else at the fort seemed to be. Perhaps it was because none of them had grown up on a farm. At this time of year in the past in Salem, he'd be hoeing a long row in Aunt Jatsy's garden, while a cousin or sister would drop dried peas or tiny lettuce seeds behind him. But there was never this much snow still on the ground, not even in Salem. There could be no planting, at least not yet. Maybe not for many more weeks. And if the weather didn't warm soon enough, he couldn't imagine how the grain could be sown or the corn have enough time to mature. The blossoms on the few remaining fruit trees might not even have time to... That's when he had to stop thinking, because his breathing would become so rapid that he feared passing out. The food reserves would last only until the end of weeding season. It was assumed there would be crops to harvest by that time, but the lieutenant couldn't see how that could be possible. And the trouble wasn't only with the crops. Unless it warmed up, there wouldn't be any grasses to graze the few select cattle, sheep, horses, and swine to propagate the herds. Several animals were already expecting, but feed was running low. The lieutenant tried to figure out how quickly grasses could grow in relation to how long the snow was lingering and when the livestock might be delivering their young. So far he couldn't see how anything, or anyone, would survive beyond weeding season. He'd been worrying about this for weeks. A few times he tried to talk to Slither about it, but the old man, whose daily naps were longer and more frequent, just waved off his concerns. I'd considered that the snows would last longer this season as well. You remember me telling your father that, don't you? But that happens sometimes. Then suddenly the sun breaks out, the air warms up, and the next week everyone's complaining about the mosquitoes. Stop worrying and wake me when it's time for dinner. But the lieutenant could see concern in his eyes. The lieutenant knew something had to be done, but he worried that writing the wrong things to General Thorne might move him out of his place and move someone like Kaya, whom he still couldn't find anything about, to be next in line. He decided that if he hadn't seen the first tiny purple flowers pushing through the snows today, they should have arrived over a moon ago. He was going to send a letter to General Thorne. An idea planted inadvertently by Director Heggick was the only thing growing around him. He slipped outside, nodded to the guard on duty, then trotted carefully down the icy stairs and looked surreptitiously around before stepping over to the flower beds. He remembered seeing all kinds of blossoms there the planting season before. He crouched and started pulling away the packed snow, digging until he came to the frozen ground. Nothing. He moved more snow away in a wider area, his fingers growing red and numb, until he finally exposed a large section of bare dirt. The ground was solid, and he realized it wasn't dirt, but hardened ash. He pulled out his long knife, apologized internally for what was about to happen to it, and plunged it into the ground. It was like trying to chip mortar. The tip of his knife was more damaged than the ground it struck. Nothing could come up. Maybe not even the yellow weedy flowers that covered the fields. With growing despair, he sat back on his heels. It was time to send the general a message. It's the right thing to do, right, Pugga? He whispered. It's an intriguing idea, young pair, but is it the right idea? Well, you did it. At least you were trying to do it. Then you did it another way. Young pair, think about that. I tried to do it but failed. It wasn't meant to be. It isn't meant to be with you either. Abandon the idea. He scoffed. But you just said it was intriguing. Yes, it is. Many things that aren't right for us to do are intriguing. It's not that they are inherently wrong. They just aren't right for us to pursue at that time. The lieutenant rubbed his forehead in frustration. So what am I supposed to do? And don't say go home. Silence greeted him. Pugga, I've got nothing else but go home. And young pair, please do it. You don't know what's coming. I've heard you say that before, he grumbled. If there was something you could do to help the world now, I'd tell you to stay. We did that before, down in pools with harvesting the crops after the eruption, then staying in Edge to help straighten out the village. But now, there's nothing more to be done. But I think there is. I have a plan, and it's not a selfish one. Pugga, I want to save this world. I want to feed it. I want to help these people survive and then thrive. Not because my name and therefore your name will become famous for it, although it might. I can't help it if it does. But because I really want to do something good. How is that wrong? Young pair, it's not wrong to want to do something good, although I think some of your motivation is suspect. But it just won't work. Not every plan intending to do something good will be successful. Can't I at least try? Of course you can try, and fail, and try something else, and fail something else, and tedious, old man. The lieutenant sighed as he stood up. He kicked the snow back into place to complete the covering of white. Tedious. That afternoon, after he did his usual inventory of the storage barns, which took less time each week since the inventory was shrinking, he sat down at the large desk and drafted his message. He rewrote it carefully, then handed it to the messenger. Please personally be sure General Thorne receives this. It's of the utmost importance. He watched from the window as the messenger rode away. Then he pulled out another sheet of paper and began to draft his next great plan. He wasn't about to leave any detail to chance. Survival of everyone was too important. General Thorne nodded to the messenger from Edge as he took the packet. And, sir, the corporal said as he handed him one more folded parchment, Lieutenant Thorne was most eager that you receive this. Thorne's eyebrows went up. Break the seal and open it for me, he ordered. The corporal did so before leaving the office. And what does my perfectly obedient son have to say to me today? Thorne snickered as he leaned back in his chair. A moment later, he leaned forward again. His head snapped to the calendar, then he swiveled to look out the window at the snow still covering the grounds of the garrison. He continued to read, and by the time he finished, his mouth was hanging open. Why, that little... He started to breathe more heavily. Zenas upstart! How could he know the way? He was startled by a knock at the door, and Colonel Wayne stood there. General, you may not realize how far your voice carries. You may want to consider keeping it down when you're getting angry at your messages. Sit down, Thorne demanded. Waynes closed the door behind him and dutifully took a seat across the desk from him, squeezing his heft between the armrests which creaked in protest. Where's the trouble? Who's causing it? And what are they planning to do? Planting season is severely delayed, according to some, Thorne answered the first question. My son, he spat to address the second, and he wants permission to take soldiers to find Terrap's land in search of food. He claims to know the way. Wayne sat back. Why, that is bold." He smiled in appreciation. "I must meet this boy. Sounds like something Perrin Shin would propose." "Or Shemzinus," Thorne barked at him. "He was the last possessor of Terep's map." "Found in the Shin home," Waynes reminded him. "What are you suggesting?" "General," Waynes said, holding out his hands. "Come on. I know you suspect Shin had it all along. How could Zenas have ever acquired it? Shin was known to have all kinds of old maps taken from the garrison's trash heaps. I'm sure it was Shin who secretly made the copy sent to the administrators. Shin who wanted to find Terep's land, and Shin who got the administrators to send the science team to look for it. The boy's instinctively following in his grandfather's footsteps. Take it as a good sign. He really is Shin's grandson." Waynes looked thoughtfully to the ceiling, missing the general's irritation. "I wonder, how does he even know about Terep? We haven't taught him in the school for decades." Thorne rocked back in his chair and glared at Waynes. "Are you really such an idiot?" Surprised at the insinuation, Waynes shrank back. "Do you realize what he's trying to do to me?" The colonel shifted uncomfortably, which meant other parts of the chair creaked. "He claims planting season is delayed, that none of the early flowers are coming up as they should. He thinks there might not even be a weeding season this year, and therefore not a harvest, and therefore no one alive in a year's time." Waynes tried to shift some more. "General, I have to tell you, a few farmers and scientists have come to me in the past weeks expressing the same concern," he admitted. "They said they usually plant early vegetables at this time of year, and while the snow isn't that big of a problem and many plants can tolerate the cold, they can't even get their plows to break through the ground. General, it seems the ash may have combined with the snows to create a hard surface that—" Thorne pounded his left fist on the desk. "They're just too early," he bellowed. "They're being unreasonable. The snow will be gone soon. It has to be. It always has been before." Waynes swallowed. "Of course, General. They must be mistaken about when they planted last year." Thorne growled quietly and turned to look at the window, to the same scenery he'd stared at for 6 moons. "Lek thinks maybe the West wasn't affected by the volcano," he said more calmly. "He thinks there may be animals to hunt, and seeds and other produce to scavenge. The ground might also be more conducive to farming and grazing if the ash didn't reach it." Waynes hesitated, weighing his response. "Intriguing theory," Thorne sighed. "Possibly." Waynes, sensing Thorne's openness, cleared his throat. "Consider, General, that if he were sent to find Terep's land and was successful, the world would surely embrace him as the guide, and he'd be more successful in acquiring mates." Thorne continued to stare out the window. "But what if he fails, Waynes? What if he's met with an accident? What if I lose him because he feels like a little exploring?" Waynes was growing impatient. "General, what if he's right? Didn't he grow up on a farm? Wouldn't he realize there's too much snow? If there is no growing season this year, we'll all be dead anyway before it's over. General, consider that this is a good idea. If you don't want your son to go, send others instead." "Send them where?" Thorne shouted to the window. "How many times did the administrator send groups looking for Terep's land, only to have them come back a year later in terror for what they've seen? There aren't even any more maps of it. The administrators destroyed all of Perrin's collection before their end. This is the only land we can inhabit. This is the only place where we can survive." Waynes's jaw shifted. "This land is beginning to terrify me. How small a herd do you think you might be left with in a year? We have to consider that we may not be able to plant anything, that the last of the animals may die because of starvation, or starving villagers, and there won't even be any ewes left for your chosen ram to create your perfect herd. 1 year from now, you may be the king of no one. Please, Lemuel, consider all options." Thorne continued to stare out the window, his jaw working menacingly. Waynes sat waiting, beads of sweat forming on his balding head. The silence continued for a minute, 2 minutes. Waynes fidgeted and wiped his brow. "There is one more option," Thorne finally said quietly. "I doubt it's even real, but 2 of my soldiers were so convinced that it was, that its name was their last word. Maybe they're the ones with food for 500,000. Waynes licked his lips in anticipation. "If you really want to pursue options, if you really think there might be another place to inhabit," Thorne paused before he whispered the last word. "Salem." "Who?" "Request denied?" the lieutenant yelled at the message. He'd forgotten he wasn't alone in the command tower until he felt the stares of 5 pairs of eyes. Hili blinked in amusement. "Problem, Lieutenant?" He started, embarrassed by his outburst. A movement by the command office door caught his attention. "Oh, yes," Major Twiggs said, waving his own message from Idemia. "There's a problem with an overly ambitious lieutenant. Boy, what in the slagging world were you thinking writing him about this ridiculous plan of yours?" Hili, with a faint smile, reached for the parchment in Twiggs' hands. "What's he done now? We're overdue for something interesting out of him anyway." He read the message, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were unexpectedly damp. "Brave, boy. Exceptionally brave. Too brave by the sound of it. How could you possibly know where Terrap's land is?" The other soldiers in the office looked at each other. "Terrap? What's a Terrap?" "Sirs, my grandmother told me all about him and what he found," the lieutenant answered honestly. Hili's face paled. "She told me, too," he whispered. He shook himself a little. "Your real grandmother," he clarified. The look on his face suggested he wished he hadn't said anything. The lieutenant held back the words, "I meant her, too." Twig threw his hands in the air. "Even if you knew where it was, you'd still have to traverse the new hill in the snow, travel past sands, then go on for who knows how many more miles." 34, sir, that's all." "What?" The lieutenant cleared his throat. "It's only 34 miles to the ruins from Sands, according to my grandmother. The Briders came from Sands," he invented madly, combining a real grandmother with real Brider knowledge to create a new story. Thorne did it all the time, and since he had the Thorne name, they seemed to know a few things, but the wide open lands start many miles before the ruins, so the distance to seeing all of Terrap's land is much shorter. The desert past Sands is barely 2 miles wide. You're correct that the hill is a formidable obstacle, but we could go around it instead. And once we're past that, we could be surveying Terrap's land in less than a week." "Sir," he plowed on boldly as he stepped up to the major, who stared at him as if he'd grown 2 new heads. The lieutenant wasn't about to be stopped by a small piece of paper from 80 miles away. "Sir, if you give me permission, I could be there and back in a mere 3 weeks. Give me 30 men, supplies, horses, and I promise I can find new options for the world. In Terrap's land, there are wild animals. Still, there have to be." He gestured wildly, ignoring Twig's dismay. There's these huge herds of ugly cattle with humped backs and horns that Terrap named bison, but they taste better than beef. Thousands of them, maybe even millions, running in herds beyond the desert, just waiting for someone to take them down with arrows. Sir, that was one of the terrors that King Quarrel's guards who accompanied Terrap encountered, and the administrator scientists faced enormous herds of ugly, stampeding cattle. They probably thought they were deformed or something because the land was poisoned, but they're not. They're just a different kind of animal, a source of food. He was oblivious to the shocked faces of the men as he enthusiastically went on. And over there, the ash didn't hit, I'm sure of it. Sand's got only a few inches, so the desert likely received nothing, and beyond that, miles and miles of flat, farmable land, and seeds and vegetation, I'm sure. It may still be cold and snowy there too, I don't know about that, but at least the soil is plantable, unlike here. Sergeant Major Hili. He grabbed the sergeant's shoulders in eagerness. No one stopped him, too stunned to hear him rambling on about something no one had ever heard of before. You know the stories, Hili. You must realize the kings and the administrators exaggerated the terrors of the ruins, which are merely carved crumbles of rock, in order to keep us from exploring and leaving this tiny piece of land. They wanted to keep us here, trapped, to control us. But why should we stay trapped? Sir, I know you know. There's nothing wrong there. Come with me. Let's find Terrap's land. Let's bring back pack horses full of bison meat. Let's feed the world and leave this cursed land. Yes, Sergeant Hili, this is the cursed land, and you know it. You're one of the few left alive who would. Please, sir, help me. Hili stared at him in astonishment. What are you talking about? What would I know? The lieutenant shook his shoulders. Please, the stories. People lived over there for hundreds and thousands of years. You learned this back in school when you were a boy. You were taught this by your teachers. I know you were. Son, I learned stories, that's true, Hili said, astonished. But they were only stories, mythologies, fantastic ideas but many of them were true. Please believe me. My grandmother knew the stories too. There were these books written by Terrap. He gestured frantically as if the book were in his hands. He described what he saw, but changed it to be children's tales that the king didn't find offensive. Several copies survived for many years. Sir, didn't you ever see any of those copies? Hili's face lost all color, and he nodded ever so slightly. I did see a book, held it for only a few hours, and read only about elephants. And I remember monkeys. But the book was returned to its owner, and I never saw it again. Sir, monkeys and elephants are real. How can you know that? Whispered Hili in hopeful wonder. Enough! Major Twig roared, causing every man in the office to jump. Lieutenant, inside my office now! Hili, you too, the rest of you, back to work! Twig grabbed the lieutenant by the arm and dragged him into the office, Hili following close behind. He shut the door behind him as the major shoved the lieutenant into a chair. What are you doing? Why are you saying such things? What is going on with you? The lieutenant, still filled with endless energy, bounced as he spoke. Sir, we can't grow anything here. The ground is rock hard, the snows aren't melting, and the new year is just days away. But no one can plant anything. Sir, we will die when the reserves run out. We have no choice but to find something else, and we need to do it now, while there's still time to plant in the western lands. Twig continued to shake his head. You've been so good and so quiet that I should have known something was up with you. Who told you about Terrap's ruins? The lieutenant sighed. I told you, my grandmother. The major positioned himself in front of the lieutenant and took the classic interrogation stance. You realize she wasn't your grandmother, not even related to you at all, right? The lieutenant sighed. Yes, sir, I know. Your real grandmothers, Ursula Thorne and Mari Shin, are dead. Have been for years. Yes, sir. Your so-called grandmother lied to you about your parentage. You were never Decet Brighter's son. Yes, sir, I know I'm not Decet Brighter's son. Then why would anything else she ever told you be correct? The lieutenant took a deep breath. Sir, what was wrong with her telling me about the ruins, about Terep's stories? They stopped teaching him in schools, then everyone ignored him. He wasn't even forbidden, just forgotten. But my grandmother shared the stories with me when I was a boy. Sir, it's been my experience that every story is rooted in some kind of truth. We're going to be desperate for food very soon. Many of the farmers aren't even trying to break the ground yet, but soon they will be and they'll discover it's like rock. But further west, the land is many times bigger than here, with no volcano, no ash, and plenty of game to feed us until we're all as fat as Slither. You don't know that, the major spat. No one can know that. So let me find out. He tried to stand up, but the major was leaning too close to his face. Sir, I'm willing to take the risk, and I bet I can find volunteers willing to risk it with me. Please, Major, Sergeant Major, he turned to Hili. Haven't enough people died this year? Do we really need everyone else to die in the next? Major Twig exhaled. The tension in his face could have strained a pumpkin. Lieutenant, I just don't know what to do with you. Why Thorne didn't drag you along with him to Idemia, but kept you here with me as your... I'll go with him. The statement from Hili was so unexpected that the lieutenant blinked, trying to make sense of his words, and Twig staggered. Hili nodded, cleared his throat, and said more distinctly, I will go with him. The lieutenant started to grin until Twig shot him a look. Poe, Twig said, turning to the sergeant major. You can't be serious. I'm not even entertaining the idea of going against General Thorne's wishes. What are you... I can't help but think he's right, Hili interrupted quietly. And I also can't help but be curious. Years ago, when Terep's map surfaced, I signed up to join the party that went to find the land. My application was rejected, but my desire to go never diminished. That's what got her so angry, that they came back and said it was a cursed land. She knew it was a lie. She was the one who gave me the book. His voice turned almost reverent, until he added, that my mother gave back. But she told me all the stories anyway. Wapiti, elephants, monkeys. A faraway smile grew on his face. Images of them were carved all over the ruins. Those animals were supposedly even further west. How far west it all goes, no one knows. No one has cared for years, but I have. Hili firmed his stance. Major Twig, we have to find something else. Let's go find those bison, see what condition the land is in, and do some exploring for once. The lieutenant slapped the armrest. Yes! He leaped to his feet. No! Twig shouted, shoving him back down. He turned to Hili. Do you realize what you're suggesting? Poe, we can't go against General Thorne's command. He waved the message like a banner in a windstorm. To allow soldiers to... What if they aren't soldiers? Hili interrupted quietly. Twig's voice turned shrill. What? The lieutenant bit his lip eagerly. What if they're not soldiers? Hili suggested calmly, his dark eyes twinkling with possibilities. What if we get together a group of volunteers, citizens, who want to find out what's west of Sands? Twig shook his head. I won't let you go, Hili. What if I resign? The major froze. The lieutenant held his breath, his admiration for the sergeant major increasing by 1,000 times. Hili began to unbutton his jacket, the hard lines on his face softening into a smile. It's happened before, you know. Someone didn't agree with the leadership and decided to make his own way. Why can't I resign today and start organizing the citizens tomorrow? I was a citizen for 6 years, you know, and I survived it. The lieutenant was grinning from ear to ear. Hili glanced over at him and winked. That snapped Twig out of his shock. "Stop it!" he shouted, and grabbed Hili's hands, which had his jacket halfway unbuttoned. "Stop it! Hili, Poe, you can't do this! You really think General Thorne would let you just up and resign? Let you march out of here with a bunch of civilians and head west? He'll hunt you down. After all, you led away the enlisted army when you were a young man, leaving the sergeant's army to kill his father." "And Lemuel was glad for it," Hili said conversationally. "He even told me once after he'd been drinking." Twig wasn't going to be tripped up by that. "Then you were fighting on the opposite side of his for many years. But he's forgiven you, Poe, of all of that." It was Hili's howl of derision that stopped Twig cold. "He forgave me? Perhaps, but Twig, I've never forgiven him," Hili snarled. "Do you realize that Thorne caused the Shins to run away in the first place? That he was chasing Perrin Shin in order to apprehend him and send him to Idamia for trial?" Twig's jaw worked up and down. I don't recall that." "Of course not," Hili said dismissively. "That's not the accepted story around here, is it? But it's the real one. Lemuel was chasing the Shins to turn them over to Genève, another name you probably don't know. Lemuel was trying to make a name for himself and wasn't bothered that Mrs. Shin was going to be executed by the administrators for merely speaking her mind, and the colonel he so admired probably locked up in the dungeon of the garrison for the rest of his life." Twig looked genuinely flabbergasted. When Hili spoke again, his voice was low and bitter. "They were my second family, Twig. They cared for me when no one else would. They fed me, clothed me, worried about me when not even my own mother could be bothered to. I joined the army because of him, to make him proud, to thank him. And what did Lemuel do? Guarantee their deaths." Never before had the lieutenant wanted so much to shout the truth about his grandparents just to see Poe's miserable expression improve, but he knew that would be the worst thing to do right now. Twig had been shaking his head in consternation for the past minute. "That may be true, I don't know, but no matter what, Poe, you can't do this and live. The only reason you are on that list to be spared is because the fort needs you. If you resign, then—" The lieutenant stood up. "What about me? Would Thorne kill me if I resigned?" The two older men looked at him. "Why do you ask such a thing?" Twig whispered despondently. "I'm just wondering," he said, not wanting to give away any more of his ideas to the major. "Don't do it!" Twig begged earnestly. "Whatever you're planning, don't do it. Even if you think you're faster and sneakier than us, just don't do anything that has me hunting you down or waiting at the edges of the desert for you, boy." He spun to Hili. "That goes for you too. Please, Poe, see reason. Thorne would execute us all." Hili looked deep into the major's eyes. "I should be dead right now, along with everyone else I grew up with in Edge." "And if you resign, you will be." The major bordered on frantic. "Let me do something good," Hili persisted. "Let me be worth the grain I've eaten. Let me justify why I lived and why every other man I knew in Miss Mari's after-school care died. I watched each one of them, Twig. I stood across the pit, and each man I knew as a boy looked me in the eyes as he breathed in his death. Only I was spared. Let me help save what remains of the world, Twig." The lieutenant smiled in admiration. He'd have to tell Mugga about this day when he saw her again. You really want to help save the world, Poe? Then keep serving here with me. Twig started buttoning up Hili's jacket as if to seal the deal. You know this village better than anyone. You've earned their respect. If you abandon Edge, what will the rest of us do? Hili caught his hands and pulled them off his jacket. Major, I want to save this village. It gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve one. Let me do something for their grandchildren. Twig exhaled. Just give me some time. This is all happening too fast. We need to think this through. Lieutenant, Twig turned to him. Give me a few days to investigate the nature of the soil. Let's talk to some of the farmers and find out what they think. Hili, he squinted before he continued, quietly figure out what would be needed for a journey for 30 men. But say nothing to anyone, either of you, about any of this. Maybe if we put together a carefully worded proposal with testimonies and concerns from more than just the lieutenant here, maybe, just maybe, the general might consider allowing an expedition to the west, but I really doubt you'll be the one to go, Lieutenant. The lieutenant held out his hands. But I know the way, he quickly added. I think. Draw me a map, Hili whispered. I got to see a copy of Terrap's map when it was at the fort where I was posted. I remember a few things on it. Maybe together we can recreate it. The lieutenant grinned. Thank you, sir. You won't regret this. Hili gave him a wan smile back. I already do. A few minutes later, Hili and the lieutenant were drafting preliminary notes at a private desk. Out of the corner of his eye, the lieutenant watched Hili, his face cheerful for maybe the first time ever. Sir, the lieutenant ventured, may I ask a personal question? Certainly. There's no guarantee I'll answer it, though. Why did you come back to Edge? Rejoin the army? Hili dropped the sharpened charcoal he was using and exhaled loudly. Sometimes I still ask myself the same question, he murmured. The truth is, Lemuel caught me on a bad day. The lieutenant waited for more. When it didn't come, he said, That's it? Hili sent him a sidelong glance. A very bad day. The lieutenant couldn't have been more intrigued. Taking a shot, he said, What was her name? Yeah, that's about right. Hili ruefully shook his head, and his smile faded. I'd been interested in a few girls over the years, but nothing much came of it. Then I met her. I'd been out of the army for a few years and was head of security at one of the housing developments in Rivers. I was making a lot of silver at it, too. She lived nearby, was in her 40s, a lovely thing. A sweet laugh, he said, almost longingly. We'd go walking and talking. I bought her a few things, took her to eat at the best inns. I was beginning to think things might finally work out for me. Then, he said, his expression hardening, I did my job too well. So well they realized that no one was even trying to break in at the housing development and hadn't since I took over. So they let me and all my staff go. They didn't need securing after all. But, the lieutenant spluttered, but that's stupid. With security gone, that's when the thieves show up. Yes, and that's also what happened, but later. Before, it meant more silver slips in the pockets of the developers by not having to pay me and my boys. Hili sighed. Suddenly, she wasn't interested in me anymore. I didn't have a job or prestige, so... I'm sorry, the lieutenant whispered. Well, Hili shrugged it off. Showed what she really cared about, didn't it? To console myself, I bought the best bottle of mead I could and drowned my sorrows in it. Wouldn't you know, that was the evening Lemuel Thorne knocked on my door. He'd been intending to meet with me for a while, he said, and he had tracked me down and found me at my lowest. Sometimes I wonder if he didn't set all of that up just to bring me down, waiting for the right moment. Wait, you don't mean you really think he set you up like that? I mean, that would entail him making your bosses fire you and getting that woman to stop seeing you. Hili looked at him blankly. When you put it that way, yes. I'm even more sure that Thorne had his hand in everything. But, Hili leaned in and said in barely a whisper, Thorne has a hand in everything, Lieutenant. Everything. Remember that. Hili sat back and continued, as if that chilling bit of news hadn't been shared. Thorne came in that night, pulled up the jug, and finished it off with me. That's when he told me he didn't care that my actions led to the death of his father. He was happy about it, actually, even back when it happened. And he needed a man like me in his fort. Well, when no one else wants you, and someone says they need you, Hili held out his hands helplessly. I'm not even sure I was fully sober before I put the uniform back on again. Lemuel certainly wasn't. He had to be carried out in the morning by his men. Do you regret it, sir, coming back? Hili peered at him. Are you trying to get me into trouble, boy? The lieutenant smiled. I think you like being in trouble. Hili scoffed a laugh. I'm not answering any more questions. Later that afternoon, as the lieutenant trotted back to the mansion, his mind filled with fantastic plans he desperately hoped he could pursue, a familiar voice interrupted his planning. Phew, that was a close one. I really thought you were going to mess up back there. Why, old man? He whispered to the air. My grandmother told me the stories. I was sure you were going to slip and say something about Mari Shin. Then when Poe started talking about her, well, I remember once at the ancient temple site when you and Bubba had a contest to see who could jump the closest to the edge of the cliff. If we hadn't stopped you, I was winning that, by the way. I knew where I could land without going over the edge. There was this outcropping. And what if you slipped, Lieutenant? What if we let you take that last jump, and you mistimed your step by just a fraction? Where would you have been? The lieutenant sighed. It doesn't matter now, does it? Today you were jumping on the edge of a cliff. I was frantically trying to keep you from slipping off. I had it under control today. I had you under control. The lieutenant marched on, grumbling in frustration. Why are you here? Young pair, if it were any other man than Lemuel, and at any other time, this would be a good idea. The bison herds you saw a few years ago have thinned from the harsh snows, but there are still 3 bison for every citizen of the world. The population could, in theory, move to the western lands, plant crops, live off bison until the harvest comes in, and settle that land successfully. The lieutenant sighed. But it's not possible now. Many years ago, yes. Even when I made a copy of the map and sent it to Nico Mal, it wasn't too late. These people could have had very different lives and been spared all kinds of pain. But they've wasted their time. More people than Poe have been interested in the western lands over the years, but none of them dared take the risk to find something new. All of them were too complacent to do anything brave. And now that life is uncomfortable, it's simply too late. Why? Why is it too late? Young pair, I can't say any more. Just believe me. Ah! The lieutenant kicked the snow. Just believe me. Why? Why do you do this to me? Why do I even bother listening to you? You're so aggravating, so tedious. All you do is get in my mind and tell me what's wrong in there. You know what, old man? I've had it. I've had it with you and your annoying little commentary about everyone and everything and your you-know-nothing lieutenant attitude and your, you know what? He stopped walking and jabbed at the sky. Just leave. Just quit annoying me with your uselessness. I don't need this. If you're not going to be helpful, just be gone. The guard at the top of the steps of the mansion acted as if he didn't hear the lieutenant ranting at the trees before him. The lieutenant didn't care who heard him or what they thought. No one knew what they were talking about anyway. He was his own man, his own conscience. He could make decisions as well as anyone, maybe even better. He knew where the ruins were. 4 years ago, he and about 100 teenagers from their region of Salem, along with many adult chaperones, had taken the journey to explore Terrap's ruins for a week. Uncle Deck had gone with them, and had pulled him and his cousin Cephas aside and pointed. A mere 34 miles that way. That's my ancestors' village of Sands. Of course, there's a bit of a desert before it, but it's a short 2 miles. Then you come to this vast valley. And as far as we know, not once did anyone in Sands ever try to cross the desert, just to see what was on the other side. Yet here we are. We even came the long way, boys. Well, he would do it. Thorne wasn't in charge of him. He was in charge of himself. He'd taken a long journey before. He could easily do it again. No one in the world had a hold on him. No one outside the world had a hold on him either. It was time to figure out the right words to say to the right people at the right time. He stomped angrily up the steps and into the mansion, alone. And that's the end of that chapter. Thank you.